After replaying some of the biggest platformers of the PS2 era, I wanted to go back and see where it all started. So recently I replayed Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon. One of these games feels just as great to play today, and the other really hasn't aged as well as people remember. So the question is, which one holds up today? Starting with Crash, and it is incredibly simple, which honestly was pretty typical for platformers of the time. The setup is that Crash escapes from one of Cortex's experiments and has to fight his way across the islands to rescue his girlfriend. What I actually appreciated about replaying this is how little the game actually stops to explain things. There aren't constant cutscenes interrupting the gameplay. Instead, the story is told mostly through the progression of the levels themselves. Starting out in the jungle, moving through temples, and eventually working your way through to Cortex's lab for the final showdown. It's very simple, but it works. And then there is Spyro's story, which is just as simple, but the way the game presents it gives the world a lot more personality. Instead of everything happening in the background, the game constantly reminds you what you are doing through the dragons that you rescue. Almost every dragon you free has a short line of dialogue. Most of the time it is nothing, but sometimes it gives you a little bit of lore about the dragon realms themselves, which makes the world feel a little bit more alive. It's still a really straightforward story overall, but because the world slowly expands as you play it, it ends up feeling a bit more memorable than what Crash was doing. I think round one goes to Spyro. Let's start with Crash, and this is where I started to notice the age of these games. His movement can feel a little clunky at times, especially in situations where you're trying to chain actions together. One issue I ran into quite a lot was landing from a jump and immediately trying to spin a crate. For some reason, Crash would just keep running forward, which usually meant running straight into an enemy or off the edge of a platform. I'm not sure if this was intentional or just a quirk of the controls, but it definitely caused quite a few frustrating deaths. Outside of that though, the basic movement works well, Crash's jumps are precise, and the simple moveset fits the more linear platforming that the game is built around. And then there is Spyro, which felt much smoother to control overall. Moving around the world feels a lot more fluid, especially with the combination of the charging and the gliding, giving you a lot more freedom compared to Crash. That being said, there were a handful of annoyances that made the game feel a bit dated. The biggest one for me was the camera. I know you can adjust it by pushing the L2 and R2 buttons, but at times it just felt way too slow when I wanted it to swing behind Spyro quickly. The verdict, both games have a few minor quirks that show their age, but when it comes to overall fluid movement, Spyro definitely feels better to control today. Combat in Crash is once again very simple. You really only have two ways of dealing with enemies, spinning into them or jumping on their heads. Most enemies go down in one hit, but the same is true for Crash unless you're holding an Aku mask. One thing I really did enjoy about the Aku masks is when you would get a triple one. The temporary invincibility along with the extra move speed feels great, especially when you're running through the levels without a care, not taking any damage. Outside of that though, the combat doesn't really evolve throughout the game, but that's honestly fine because Crash was always more focused on the precise platforming rather than fighting the enemies themselves. Spyro's combat is also really simple, but you do have to do a little bit more work. Instead of just one main attack, Spyro has both the charge and the fire breath, which already gives you a little bit more flexibility. What I really liked though was the variety of enemies that the game throws at you. Some enemies are too large to charge, so you have to use the fire breath. Others might be wearing metal plating, which means you have to wait for them to turn around before you can actually damage them. Those little variations make you think a bit more about how you approach each enemy, which helps the combat from feeling repetitive as the game goes on. The verdict, both games keep their combat mechanics pretty simple, but because Spyro introduces more enemy variety and situations to deal with, this one goes to Spyro. Let's start with Spyro's level design, which is built around exploration. Each world starts with a hub with different levels that branch off from it, and that alone makes the game feel much more open and enjoyable to explore. Inside the levels themselves, there's rarely just one direction to go. There are usually multiple paths, hidden areas, and plenty of places to encourage you to explore a bit further to find extra gems or dragons. These levels also make great use of Spyro's glide ability, which adds a lot more verticality and scale to the environments compared compared to Crash. You're constantly looking for high points you can glide from to reach new areas. The only thing I didn't love was that some of these levels felt a little random compared to the hub world that they were attached to. Not every level matched the theme of the area that you were currently exploring. But overall, Spyro's level design does a great job encouraging exploration and making the world feel big. Then there is Crash, and it takes almost the complete opposite approach. Instead of open worlds designed for exploration, Crash focuses on smaller, tightly designed stages built around precise platforming. One thing I really liked was the sense of progression you get from the map screen. As you move along the island, the environments gradually change, and that progression is reflected in the levels themselves. It gives the whole adventure a clear sense of direction. The levels are also much more about trial and error difficulty. You'll probably die quite a lot whilst learning the patterns of enemies, traps, and moving platforms. But the challenge is really the whole point of Crash. If the levels were too easy, the game wouldn't be nearly as memorable. The platforming itself also stays interesting thanks to the variety in how the levels are presented. Some are traditional 2.5D platforming sections, while others have Crash running towards or away from the camera, which constantly changes how you approach new levels. The verdict, both games were really fun to explore in their own ways, but when it comes to consistently engaging platforming and how the challenge evolves throughout the game, I think Crash takes the edge in level design. And finally, we have the music and sound design. And honestly, this one is so hard because both of these games are pretty much 10 out of 10s in their own way. Both Spyro and Crash have incredibly memorable soundtracks and sound effects that people still recognize almost 30 years later. From Crash's jungle beats to Spyro's more atmospheric tracks, both games absolutely nail the audio side of things. Even the sound effects like collecting gems or breaking crates are instantly recognizable. So for me, this category is a tie. I think both games completely nailed their music and sound design. So tallying the points, we tied with music, but Crash took the level design and Spyro swept with the story, movement, and combat. I think that this makes Spyro the winner only by a small margin, but I think that it's the best to replay in 2026. But replaying these legendary games back to back really highlighted the differences between them. While both were starting points for some of the best developers in the industry, it's clear that when they were making these games, they also had really different priorities. Even so, these games still have more personality and replayability than most of the titles coming out today. But if you had to pick one to play right now, which one are you grabbing first? Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.